Something is wrong with this cloth. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally, structurally, impossibly wrong. And the more scientists look at it, the worse the problem gets. One cloth, answers pulling in every direction. And the latest one, the one that came from artificial intelligence, might be the strangest answer yet. For over 50 years, the Shroud of Turin has been subjected to more scientific scrutiny than almost any other object in human history. Physicists, chemists, forensic specialists, art historians, archaeologists, they have all taken their turn, and not one of them has walked away with a clean answer. The stakes could not be higher. If this cloth is what some believe it to be, it would not simply rewrite religious history, it would rewrite recorded history. Full stop. Here is what makes this investigation different from every documentary you have seen before. Every single time a new tool arrives, every time science gets sharper and more precise, the mystery does not shrink. It grows. In 1988, carbon dating was supposed to settle this forever. It didn't. And what researchers are finding now is stranger still. Here is the specific claim that started a firestorm in the scientific community. When researcher Liberato De Caro and his colleagues ran advanced X-ray scattering analysis on the shroud's linen fibers in 2022, they weren't looking at the image at all. They were looking at the cloth itself. The molecular aging of the linen, and what they found, pointed to a date of roughly 2,000 years old. Not the medieval period the 1988 carbon tests had declared. That finding alone cracked the case back open. But it is what happened when artificial intelligence entered the picture that turned a crack into a chasm. Brazilian researcher Giulio Fanti has spent decades building three-dimensional digital models from the shroud's image data. The work is painstaking and precise. You take the intensity of the image, how dark or light each region of cloth appears, and you map it against depth. Lighter areas of the image correspond to greater distance from the cloth's surface. Darker areas indicate closer contact. What emerges, when you process that data correctly, is not a flat picture. It is a topographic map, a relief of whatever pressed against that linen. And here is where the geometry problem begins. When researchers, including those working with Fanti's methodology, ran those three-dimensional models against the proportions of a real human face, a face wrapped in burial cloth the way a first-century Jewish burial would have required, the numbers did not match. The face on the shroud is too flat, too geometrically regular. The proportions align far more cleanly with a bas-relief sculpture, a shallow three-dimensional carving, than with the contoured, asymmetric surface of an actual human head pressed against fabric from above and from the sides. This is not a vague aesthetic impression. Statistical comparisons drawn from measurements of living human subjects exposed the mismatch in precise, documented terms. A real face wrapped in cloth produces specific distortions. The nose compresses, the cheeks spread. The geometry goes irregular in predictable ways. The shroud face does not show those distortions. It shows the clean, almost idealized proportions of something that was never alive. Italian specialists took this further. A point-by-point rebuttal was published in the peer-reviewed journal Archaeometry, one of the most respected publications in the field of archaeological materials analysis. The authors walked through the geometric inconsistencies with clinical precision, arguing that the image encoding, the way depth information is embedded in the cloth, is inconsistent with a human corpse wrapped in linen. It is consistent with a shaped surface, a relief, something crafted rather than born. Now, before you conclude this settles the forgery argument, understand what you are actually holding. Because a medieval forger capable of encoding three-dimensional geometric information into a linen cloth, information that would remain invisible and undetectable until the invention of modern digital scanning technology, would be the most sophisticated artist in the history of human civilization. By several centuries. The technique for extracting this kind of depth-encoded image data did not exist until NASA researcher Pete Secondo Pia accidentally discovered it in 1898 when he photographed the shroud and noticed the negative image on his photographic plate looked more realistic than the cloth itself. That was the first hint. The full three-dimensional encoding wasn't properly mapped until the VP8 image analyzer was applied in 1976. A medieval forger encoding data for a technology that wouldn't exist for 600 years. So we are left with a geometry problem that has no clean exit. If the image was formed by contact with a human body, the proportions are wrong. If the image was formed by contact with a sculpted relief, the sophistication required defies the era. And if artificial intelligence is now confirming that the face geometry does not match a real wrapped corpse, then whatever was pressed against that linen, it was not what most people have assumed for centuries. The question is not whether something strange happened here. The question is what? And the answer, when it finally arrives, is going to force a much harder conversation about what we thought we knew. In 1988, three of the most respected radiocarbon laboratories on the planet, Oxford, the University of Arizona, and the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, each independently dated a sample of the shroud linen. Their verdict was unanimous. The cloth was medieval. Specifically, it dated to somewhere between AD 1260 and 1390. Case closed, said the headlines. Elaborate hoax, said the scientists. The shroud, they declared, was the work of a medieval forger. That verdict held for decades, and for many people, it still does. But here is the specific problem. In 2019, a peer-reviewed challenge was published by researcher Tristan Casabianca in the journal Archaeometry. Casabianca had spent years trying to obtain the raw statistical data from the original 1988 Nature study, the actual numbers behind the published conclusions. What he found when he finally got them was not what anyone expected. The data, when properly analyzed, showed a level of statistical heterogeneity that the original authors had not fully disclosed. In plain terms, the samples tested were not behaving as if they came from a single, uniform piece of cloth. The numbers were inconsistent in ways that should have raised flags in 1988. They didn't. Or if they did, those flags were quietly lowered. That alone would be enough to reopen the question. But then came 2024. A team of Italian researchers at the University of Padua published results from a different dating method entirely, one based on X-ray analysis of cellulose degradation in the linen fibers themselves. Their conclusion directly contradicted the 1988 carbon date. According to their measurements, the rate at which the cloth's cellulose had broken down at a molecular level was consistent with linen that is approximately 2,000 years old. Not medieval, ancient. Both studies are peer-reviewed. Both claim to be measuring the same artifact, and they arrive at conclusions separated by more than 1,000 years. This is not a fringe debate happening on conspiracy websites. This is happening inside the scientific literature, between credentialed researchers using legitimate methodologies. The 1988 result has not been quietly confirmed. It has been actively contested, and the contest is ongoing. Now, some researchers point to a simple explanation for the discrepancy. The 1988 sample was taken from a corner of the cloth that may have been repaired during the medieval period, rewoven with newer linen threads after fire damage in 1532. If that's true, the carbon dating would have measured the repair, not the original cloth. That explanation has its own critics, and its own defenders, and no one has been able to definitively settle it. What we know for certain is this: the dating war is not over. It never really was. And when AI was applied to the deeper structure of this cloth, beneath the surface, beneath the image itself, what it found made the dating question feel almost secondary. Almost. Here is a specific claim that no serious researcher disputes. The image on the Shroud of Turin is not painted on the cloth. It is in the cloth. And the difference between those two things is the entire mystery. When the STURP team, the Shroud of Turin Research Project, conducted their comprehensive examination in 1978, they brought instruments capable of detecting trace amounts of paint, dye, pigment, and chemical residue at levels far below what the human eye could perceive. Their conclusion, published across multiple peer-reviewed papers, was unambiguous. No paint, no dye, no pigment. No known artistic medium accounts for the image. Whatever created the discoloration on those linen fibers, it was not applied by a brush, a stamp, or any tool that left behind a detectable substance. That finding alone should have ended the forgery argument. It didn't. What makes the image even more difficult to explain is where it exists within the fiber itself. The coloration is not on the surface of the linen threads. It is confined to the outermost fibers, the very topmost layer of each individual thread, at a depth measured in nanometers. For context, a human hair is roughly 80,000 nanometers wide. The image on the shroud exists in a layer that is a fraction of that. No medieval artist working with any known technique could have applied color with that kind of precision. It isn't physically possible with the tools of the era. It may not be physically possible with the tools of any era. And yet, someone at some point suggested it was done deliberately. A 14th century document, cited occasionally by skeptics, claims that a painter confessed to creating the shroud as a deliberate fraud. The document names no painter. It provides no method. It offers no explanation of how a medieval craftsman produced sub-fiber depth coloration that 20th century instruments couldn't replicate or even fully explain. The confession, if it can be called that, describes a result without describing a mechanism, which is not really a confession at all. The mechanism is everything, because the image also encodes something that no painter could have known to include: three-dimensional spatial information, distributed across the cloth in a way that corresponds precisely to the contours of a human body. When researchers fed the image into VP8 image analyzers, equipment originally designed for NASA to process planetary photographs, the cloth produced a geometrically accurate three-dimensional relief. Paintings don't do that. Photographs don't do that. The VP8 analyzer was designed for objects in space, and the shroud image behaved as if it were a map of physical distance, not a flat artistic composition. That is the deepest unsolved problem surrounding this cloth. Not the age, not the origin, the mechanism. What process, applied to linen, produces a superficial coloration at nanometer depth, encodes accurate three-dimensional information, leaves behind no chemical signature, and cannot be reproduced by any technology we currently possess? No one has a verified answer. But when AI was directed to analyze what lies beneath that image, the biological material, the genetic traces, the microscopic evidence left behind by centuries of contact, the question didn't get simpler. It got stranger. In 2026, a comprehensive DNA study of the Shroud of Turin was published, and the results were extraordinary. Not because they solved anything, because of exactly what they found, and what that finding made impossible. The specific claim is this: researchers identified genetic material from human sources, microbial communities, plant matter, and animal traces, all present on the same cloth. That alone is not surprising. The shroud has been handled, displayed, venerated, and transported across centuries and continents. Of course it carries biological material. The question was always what that material could tell us about where the cloth came from and when. The answer, when it arrived, was both fascinating and deeply frustrating. The genetic signatures recovered from the cloth did not cluster around a single region or a single time period. They spanned multiple continents. Researchers identified DNA consistent with populations from the Middle East, from Europe, from Central Asia, and from parts of Africa. Plant DNA pointed to species native to regions across the ancient world. The microbial communities embedded in the fibers reflected not one environment, but many, accumulated over what the researchers described as centuries of handling across vastly different geographic locations. For a moment, that sounded like confirmation of something. A cloth that had traveled from the ancient Near East through Byzantine hands into medieval Europe would carry exactly that kind of layered, multinational biological signature. The geographic spread of the DNA matched, at least roughly, the proposed historical journey of the shroud through the centuries. But then the researchers made a statement that reframed everything. They confirmed, explicitly, that the DNA evidence cannot be used to determine the cloth's true age. Contamination from pilgrimage contact, from the hands of clergy and scholars and curious visitors across hundreds of years, makes it impossible to isolate which genetic material is original and which arrived last Tuesday. The biological trail, despite its richness, leads nowhere definitive. More data was recovered than anyone expected, and yet the origin question remained exactly where it started. What the DNA study did accomplish was something more subtle. It demonstrated the extraordinary complexity of what this cloth has absorbed over its documented history. Every person who touched it left something behind. Every environment it passed through deposited something in its fibers. The shroud is not just a piece of linen. It is a biological archive of everywhere it has ever been, and everyone it has ever encountered. And that archive is so layered, so densely overwritten, that reading it clearly may be beyond our current capability. The contamination problem is not a minor technical footnote. It is the reason that every biological test applied to the shroud carries a built-in asterisk. The DNA went cold not because there was too little information, but because there was far too much. And yet, beneath all of that biological noise, beneath the contamination, beneath the centuries of accumulated contact, something else was waiting. Something the DNA study wasn't designed to find. Something that AI, when directed at the deepest structural layers of the cloth, was the first to identify clearly. What lies beneath the image is not what anyone was looking for. The deeper the analysis goes, the more the cloth resists every explanation. The next full AI scan may finally break the deadlock, and what it reveals could rewrite everything. Subscribe now and be first to see what the next scan uncovers.